Hey everyone, welcome back to the React course. I'm super excited to have you. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about components and how props and states and components, all three of these work together. But before that, let me start our app first. So I'll go ahead and do npm start and it's going to pop up in my browser for a second. Now, what I want to talk to you about is, okay, there is this sense of notion that I talked to you about last lecture that whenever we win or lose, we actually don't show the user the controls of the game anymore, so they can't actually hijack our game. But then again, I thought of it and I thought personally felt that you coming from JavaScript, CSS, and HTML land, you might be just be thinking that okay, it's there on the page, and I might be doing some trickery like document.get element by ID, getting the reference to this top div somehow. Okay, I'm not sure right now, but somehow, and then I'll just set the display to 0 or something like that. So it's there in the DOM, right? It's there. I'm writing it here. So in traditional HTML sense, if I write it like this and conditionally I am hiding and showing something, it's there on the DOM. So somebody can go ahead in the console and with the right knowledge and with the right tools can get those out. So that was a problem. But I want to show you something, and this is quite neat. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and change this number to 2 again, and I'll save our app. I'll go here. Now I want to work with the inspector today. So I'm going to close this one. Just a second. So I'm going to close this one and I'm going to go to our app and I'm going to click here. So if you see, this is this root that we built. Now this is our app. This is this whole thing because it's giving the background or something. This is the header that it's also flexible. Now this is the first div. So where is this div coming from? So this is this one, this div right here. Okay. Now inside that div we have a paragraph. Okay, that is what we are expecting it to be. Then a button, then a button. Now there are two important things. There is no mention of hooray you win and sorry you couldn't win. But you're writing that on the DOM, right? There it should be somewhere here. So actually it's not. And let me just increase this and win. So I won. And now you can see here suddenly the DOM got changed completely. You have an app header, then you have an app header, and then you have just the text and nothing else because that's how we designed it to be. This is this and this is this. That's it. So nobody can do that trickery of knowing JavaScript and going to the console and expect elements and playing with it. Now that being out of the picture, the explanation for that is that React does that DOM manipulation itself. So it will only render that particular thing that is required and not show anything else. So this and this complete thing are three different things, of which one and only one will be shown on the screen at a given time. And when the condition changes and it moves from one state to the other, so say I am playing and I'm winning or losing, then it always goes through the same step and chooses one of them. Depending on the condition, whatever it chooses, it's okay. It can choose any of those three depending on the condition. But the main point here is that whatever choice is being made, that choice is gonna stay and reflect as the only choice, and no other element or extra bits are gonna be there. So that is something I just wanted you to keep in mind, and also wanted to show that there is a sense of security here. Okay, so great. Now that being out of the picture, now let's talk about components in details. Now components are actually UI units that let you collect a single thought which you can actually control in isolation. So what I mean by that is, say imagine you having a website. Now there are multiple key components to a website, right? So there is always a header to a website, and in most cases there is always a footer to the website. Now these are isolated chunks which have specific use cases only. Now in your header Most probably what you have is you have a logo and you have a navigation. So these two things are also unified chunks. So say you have a navigation system that is supposed to work on an isolation. So it's it's actually a fact that pressing home on one page will also work the same as pressing home on the other pages, right? So that is also isolated chunk. Now you have something. Now imagine you are on a blog, or say a website called Medium. Then they have a particular manner of representing their blogs. That's also something I showed you while we were on the React docs. So there was three sections, here, here, and here, and then there was this semantical similarity, that heading, and there was a paragraph, then there was another paragraph, then there was a heading, then there was a paragraph, then there was another paragraph. So my point is that what components essentially are chunks of UI that is designed in isolation and is powerful for reusability. So those can be reused over multiple use cases. Now the reusability part is controlled by props. So you can pass different attributes and it will give you different results based on what are you trying to use. That part is controlled by props, and that is powerful, as I already talked to you about from React. So we are going to look into that. We are going to look into different types of components because there are two, and we are going to look how they similar they are and how different they are, and also look at the state prop and component relationship. That's something I want to call it, and this is not a official term, but I like to call it that because then I can have a mental model of what's happening. So what the mental model is: state, prop, and component relationship. Now for today I'll scrape this whole thing completely, or okay, let's just keep this one. And in our sources folder, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another folder, and I'm going to call this components. And this is a very common architecture or folder structure choice, and this is also called project structure. So this is a very common project structure side where you will have a folder inside your sources folder called components, and all major components that you are going to create throughout your project are going to sit somewhere here. So I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call this my first component. Now this is just a JavaScript file, so I'm going to save it with .js. Now see this idea that I'm starting my component with a capital M, and I could have done that with smaller m, but the convention here is, and the recommendation from React team is, you start your component's name with a capital letter, so I'm doing that. Now there are two types of component. One are so there are two type of components. One are functional components and other are class-based components. Now you actually seen both of those already. So in initial times when we created that page builder thing, that was a functional component, and using class app extends component is a class-based component. So you've already seen both, but let me do a formal introduction to both. Okay. So first of all, we are going to look at functional components because they have lesser amount of information related to them. So it's going to be easier to grasp that. Once we've grasped that, then what we are going to do is we are going to look at how class-based components differ and what are the similarities. So let's talk about functional components. Now, what a functional component is, essentially what you want to achieve with a functional component is you want to achieve a UI that will be reused over a period of time. So what I mean by that is that essentially what you're gonna do is you're gonna create UIs that not essentially have logic associated with it. So what I mean by that is, say you are creating a website, okay, and now you want to create the layout of the foot article page. So say you want to show blogs, and then what you want to do is you want to have a given structure for blogs, right? So one blog is gonna be something like a rectangle. So say something like this. So it's going to be like this, a rectangle, and it's going to have a heading, then it's going to have a paragraph and another paragraph. So that's what our common structure is going to look like. So how do you do that? Now what you need to do is you need to create first a function, as per the name, functional component. So I'm going to do a constant, and I'm going to call it also my first component. Now there is one similarity that I want to talk to you about right now, this, that any props, any component, be class based or functional, both receive one argument from wherever they are called. So wherever the rendering is happening, they receive an argument, and that's called props. Now this is just a single argument, and its type is, you guessed it right, object. So every component gets passed an argument, be functional or class based. Okay, that argument is called props. Okay, and what that is, props is a object of all attributes passed to that component. Now let's go ahead and see what this actually means. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a heading. So say h1, and this is my first component. And I'm going to close this with another h1. Now what am I essentially doing is I'm creating a variable called my first component, and I'm assigning it a function. So that function takes one argument called props, and it does something. Sorry. What is the only requirement of a functional component is that it returns JSX. So what a functional component does is it takes in props and it returns some JSX. So right now I'm not returning anything. So for this to be a proper component, I need to return something. So right now I'm just going to return this one line here, and this is not the best component you can make because it's actually not reusable and it's actually not doing anything depending on the props. So this might not be the best component you can make, but this is actually a component. So if I go back to my app.js file, then I can use this. And how to use this? You got to import that. So now if you want to use your any component in any file related to components or rendering or anything, you need to import that component. But before importing, the one thing that you have to do is you have to export that component in its parent file. So right now I'm in my components and I have a component here, but I'm not exporting this. So if I don't export this component, no file outside this file can use this component. So how to export that? So to export your component, you write export, Now export will export my component, so I'm going to be like export my first component. Okay, just a second, it's giving me a red line. So what I just did there, I said export this component of mine called my first component and export this as the default component. So whenever somebody is gonna import anything without a name from this particular file called my first component.js, export this component, my first component. Now if you go back and in our app file we can import that. So import. Now what I can do is I can do a trickery here, because that's a default export. I can change the name. So I'm going to be like my first component is a nickname for my import, and I'm going to import it from. Now how do you import things? Currently you are in the source folder. You want to jump into the components folder where this file lives. Now this components folder lives inside the components sources folder, sorry. So firstly we want to say that we want to go from somewhere inside the sources folder. So the dot is essentially saying that I'm currently in my sources folder and I want to start the path from here. Then I want to go to something called components, and VS Code is really smart about this, and it can show you insights on where you might, what might be the possible places you can go and so on. So if I just do that, it also tells me and it auto completes for me. So that is a great feature. Now once I've imported that, I can use it in my UI. So up top at my render, what I can do is uh, here, let's just have that myc component rendered. Now you have already seen this, me doing this, that the rendering of a component is done using this JSX syntax, open bracket, then a component, and then this. Now if I just go back and refresh, you'll see something new here. It's taking a little while. The server might be not running properly. Let's just close this. Let's just close the browser. The browser already closed. Let's go back to our VS Code and start again. So npm start. Let's wait for it to run. So it's gonna pop up any second. And it gives us error. React must be used in the scope when you are using JSX. So it says, okay, sorry, my bad. Actually, the problem is in this component, I didn't import React, which I have to. So if I'm using JSX, I have to import React. So I'm going to import it right now. Import React from React. Now if I save this, it'll run successfully, and I can clearly see that it says this is my first component and under that is my regular old app. Now I want to go back to the app thing and I want to pass some props. So what kind of props I can pass is that I can say something like a is equal to say 1. Now one good thing I just did and I want to show you here is that I'm passing a and then I'm using the expression syntax and then I'm using 1. This trick is done when you want to use anything related to JavaScript. So I don't want it to be a string. I actually want a to be a number, and that's why I'm doing this. If I wanted it to be a string, I'll just quote it. So say something like 2. Now b is 2 true, but it's string true 2, and here a is 1 and it's a number 1. Okay, so I'm going to save this here and I'm going to go back, and before returning I'm just going to console.log all the props that I have. So props. So if I save this and if I go back, Then if I go to my inspect element and then I go to my console and I'm going to increase the size of it because so that you can see it clearly, then you can clearly see that coming from my first components.js, I have an object that has two values. A is 1 and you can clearly see that it's a number, not a string. And then you have a key B that is 2. Now another thing you can do with props is you can have something of a two-way nature. So currently how I'm using my props is I'm using them as a single tag, but you can also use components as two tags. So there is going to be a starting tag and there is going to be a closing tag. And how that scenario comes across is that you can do something like this. Now you can pass here something, and let me just say this is a child to my custom component. And I'm going to save this and I'm going to go back and I'm going to see that there is this new addition. In this object, I never added this key called children. I just added A and B. Now I have this extra key called children, and this contains the string that I passed in between. So how did that happen? So when you're using the open bracket and the closing bracket syntax, whatever you write in between that, and this can be anything from a simple text string to complicated JSX, all that is passed via props to the component, and the key to that is children. So it tells me two things: that props are dependent on how I am using the component. If I'm using it as just a single component, I'm not using a closing tag for this, then it's not going to have that children property. But if I'm using it as opening and closing tags, and whatever I pass in between is going to be passed as the children. So one more insight I can get from this is this children key is automatically generated. So avoiding using that as a parameter that you pass or attribute you pass on your own is going to be better, because then React won't be confused. And if you try to pass children as an attribute to a component, it might also give you an error because it's a reserved word and it doesn't want you to use that. So it's similar to keywords in whatever language you're coming from and comfortable with. So that is the idea and the whole notion behind this. Now you can also do very complicated things with components and even function components. I'm gonna erase this for now, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just come here and I'm gonna ignore this whole bit and I'm gonna just use props.children here. I'm gonna save this and I'm just gonna go back, and did I remove that from there? Just a second, I gotta check that. So if I go back and if I see what is the current children, so this is the current children. And if I save the app and go back to my file and I go console.log props, and if I save this and if I go back, I can see that the children key is clearly there, and I'm also rendering that up top. Okay, works correctly as we expect it to be. Now this is not just functional components. This is the nature of having just a single tag and having opening and closing tag is valid across both. So this is also true for functional components and this is also true for class-based components. Now what actually functional components are used for chunking the UI. So say you have a complicated UI, and let's try to make a complicated UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with you right here I'm going to create a complicated UI. So say we are trying to create something that is gonna show user its profile. So first what we want is we want a paragraph, and I'm gonna use this as our logo. So I'm just gonna do something. I'm gonna wrap this whole thing in a div. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go inside and I'm gonna create a paragraph, and this is our logo. I'm gonna close that. Then what I want in parallel is that I have some buttons. So I'm going to also use paragraphs for that. So home button, and I'm going to copy paste. And I'm going to name them randomly. Okay. So P button. I'm just going to save this. And if I go back and I see this complicated UI thing set up for me. Now, if I wanted to say use V and B depending on the props that I want, then I can do something like props.a and props.p, and you know that I missed something and I'm good now. So those will be rendered conditionally, and I'm gonna close the console for a bit so we can have some more space. Now that's what actually the use case for function components is. Now when we are going to build a project from scratch, we are going to use them heavily, and we are going to use them as a supply unit for complicated UI chunks that we are going to use throughout our app. So say we want to build the navigation bar, we are going to build it via function component most probably. And say we want to build something more complicated, say a whole header or a whole body portion of the app, and we want it to be responsive across multiple devices, then we are going to heavily use this. From this discussion, what I want you to take with you is that this architectural design of having a components folder inside the sources folder and then having a component starting with a capital name is very common. Okay, so this is what a function components looks like. You import React because you are going to use JSX. Then you simply create a variable and assign it to arrow function. All components take in props. So every single component gets passed this thing called props. Now the only thing that a function component has to do for being or qualifying as a function component is return some JSX, and that's what we are doing right here. Then for allowing other files to use our component, we do export default my first component. In our app file, to use that component, what we do is we import it. Now the default keyword gives us this ability to name it whatever we want. So we shrink the name from my first component to myc. That also means my first component. Or if I say mfc, doesn't matter, same thing, just a name. And you can import it, and then you can use it in two ways. Either you can use it in opening and closing, then you get this extra key called children, and you can use it in just one tag, so single tag, and then you won't get that extra key called children. Now this opening and closing paradigm and having this ability to pass in children is very powerful, and this is a really important concept we are gonna deal with in a problem sort of that we might encounter over a bigger app. So when our app grows a very large amount in size, then we encounter some problems that are specific to large apps only. So in that case, we are going to deal with something that is going to use this. So knowing this upfront will help you. So when done with that, now I can show you some of how class-based components work. So let's first talk similarities. So class-based components use the class keyword and they make a class. You can name it whatever you want. So I'm naming my app, and I need to extend it from components that come from React. I've already talked to you about how the syntax works and everything. Now I'm also using React because I want to use JSX. So To choose JSX, I have to import React. Then I'm gonna import this basic styling that I will talk to you about later. And this is our that component, function component we created. Now let me just remove things that we don't need right now, and I'm not going to explain those whatever I'm going to comment. And the reason being that I'm going to talk about components and what are the essential parts of components, and these are other details that are not important to components right now. So one method that you have to implement is called render, and inside render you also have to return JSX. So all this is just JSX. And if you've been following the series from throughout, then you already know that this is JSX. Now, where is our app component actually used? So if you remember, in our index.js file, we use our app component. So we import our app from the app file and we use it here. Now I can pass props here, and props are also got passed here, but they are not just available to us. So what I can do is I can pass a prop here and I can do it like this. So say what key you want. Let's just call it C, and let's say ABC. I'm just putting in random values. Okay, you can have anything. In most cases you won't see anything being passed here, but yeah, in certain cases you might, and I'm just going to show you that. So you know how to use state inside our render, but do you know how to use props? So the first instinct might be, so just go ahead, and as we know that from I already told you that props are passed to both functional components and class-based components. So the first instinct might be that there might be a variable called props available somewhere somehow. Now if I'm going to save this might not work properly because I am not telling it where is the props variable. Yes, that's a fact that the props variable is passed to us, but we are not telling it exactly where it is. So I'm going to do something in that you can tell me if you know why I did that or not. So I'm going to be like this dot props. Now you know why I did that, right? Because the props is passed to app, and this right here will refer to app. So where I need to look, if I'm JavaScript, you are telling me where I need to look for the thing called props, and this will point to app. So inside app somewhere there has to be a property called props. And if I'm going to save this now, if I go back, and okay, so I commented a lot more than I had to, so I'm just going to comment this also because this is not going to work without that. So if I copy that now, and if I see this, if I go to the console right here, I see that line being printed here to, and it also says it came from this. So to use props inside of class-based component, you use this dot props, and in a functional component you just pass the prop thing and you use it as, so sorry for that. So in a class-based component, what changes is the props gets converted dot to this dot props. Now props are not restricted to numbers, strings, or anything like that. You can pass complete functions around, because in JavaScript functions are just first class members. Everything in JavaScript is object. A number is object, a string is object, a function is object, and an object is object. So you can pass around all the values that you want to. So say I want to refactor our app with you, and with our current knowledge of whatever we have built, we are going to do that. So I'm going to remove this, and I've already shown you how this works. So I'm going to uncomment this. Now what I want to do is I want to remove this because this is just demonstration bit, and I want to do actually something practical with you right now. So you see that this right here is a big UI that I am using directly in my render, but the better choice would be to put it somewhere else. I'm going to copy this whole thing right here. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back to my first component. And rather than using this whole thing, I'm going to remove this. I'm going to put it here. Now, first things first, there are problems, and let's talk about those. So this dot state is nothing, so let's remove that. And how can we communicate with the outer world from this component? Say the components world is just the props, so how do we communicate from the outer world? So what I have is props, so I'm going to use something called props.currentPage, and currently there is nothing called props.currentPage, and have to pass that to the component. Also this dot state dot guess number is also nothing, so props dot guess number. Then chances left is also nothing, so props dot chances left. And then current number is nothing, so props. Now the interesting bit is here, this dot increment and this dot decrement are two functions that are gonna change the state. Now the state lives in the app component, but the good thing is that these functions are functions of JavaScript, and they can be passed as props. So what we can do is we can do props dot increment and props dot decrement. Now we have this isolated unit that works on a complex UI, and that UI is our game UI. Okay, but it works on some parameters that is passed to this via our parent app. So this is our app right now, and I'm not using that anywhere, so I'm going to delete this whole thing on the hope that I'm not going to screw anything up and I don't have to control Z a lot of times. But on a hope, I'm just going to do my component, and then I'm going to pass all those things that I wanted to. So chances left is something that is inside state, so I'm going to use this dot state dot, sorry, not set state, state dot chances left. Then I need to have another prop, and this is a common way of writing bigger components with multiple props, so you will see this very often. And current number also comes from state, so this is something called this dot state dot current number. Then I have something called guess this number, so I'm gonna use that, this dot state dot guess this number. Then I want to pass those functions that are actually going to work with the UI. So increment is this dot increment, and decrement is this dot decrement. Now if I save this, you see my render here looks so much cleaner. And if I name this component also logically, let's call it my game component, game component. Okay, and if I just go down here in my render, I'm just gonna call it game component. Now if you just take a look from when we were not using components to isolate logical bits and UI bits, and now when we are using that, it looks so much cleaner and I can read it so faster. I can clearly see that there is a game component and it takes these parameters, so I can clearly identify that okay, there is something called this game component and it works on these things. Now if I just go up at top, I can clearly see, if I have just enough knowledge of React, then I can clearly see that these three things are state variables. So this should control how the state or how the game is going to behave. These two are functions. If I just move up, and I know that these are responsible for changing the game state. So what are these three responsible for? I'm going to write it as a comment up here. So these three are responsible for game state. Also, these two these two are responsible for changing the game state. Now, this comment up here is crucial if somebody else is gonna read your code. And if you are writing code like this, whosoever is coming and working on the project after you is gonna have such a easy time understanding. Now, they just have to go to the component to see what actually is happening. So if I just jump to the component, I see, okay, then I see this condition, okay, so I get this current page, current number, okay, this can be something and guess this number. So I can, from this line, I can clearly deduce that, okay, if I guess the number and the current number are equal, then I win. Cool. How do I win? If there are no more chances left, then I lose. And this is my game controller. So this right here is my game controller. And I can see every single thing clearly right now. If I go back and I see, work with my app a little, I see it's working exactly what it's supposed to. So if I decrease, it actually shows me every single thing. Then if I increase, my chances are no more available to me, so I lose. If I refresh the app, it gets me to the initial state back. This approach is how React apps are designed. You isolate units of logic that can be used in isolation. So I abstracted out our older app into something called a game component, and that I removed the whole UI bit from actually the app and made it a separate component. Now, the good thing about this is currently before this I was just having one game. Now I can actually do something clever, and I'm going to use this. Now, rather than having just say one single game running on my screen at one time, I can have multiple of them running. But there is a problem with this, and I'm going to show you what is the problem with this. If I increment one, both will be incremented because they are using the same state variables. And when the state changes, everything gets changed accordingly. So just changing these variables, calling it change state, chances left 1 and chances left 2, and just calling them differently will give you multiple games with the same structure. So that's where React is a lot of power is, that it lets you do these things. Now, one other thing that is really common is passing elements that are that are responsible for the state and that are gonna control the state. So these control changes to the state, and these are just the state, whether it be a game or whether it be anything. A very common paradigm is to have functional components as the UI units and a single or multiple class-based components that live up top, and those have the logic, and then whatever necessary logic is to be used inside that component. Say here that we needed these two functions to control the state, and we needed these three parameters to actually tell what is happening in the current state. So we passed all five of those things here, and then we got the ideal behavior that we wanted to. So that is very powerful and extremely useful when you are designing complicated apps. Now, one more thing that I want to talk to you about is that the major differences from functional component to class-based components are actually controlling the logic of the app. But you can do lots more with it. And what is that? That something is called life cycles. So whenever our app loads, and till the time that single component is visible on your screen, it has a life cycle. What is a life cycle? Life cycle is similar to life cycles in humans. There is a start when the component starts, and there is an end. And in that whole process, you have multiple points you can use to do very complicated things with React. So you can actually pinpoint that, okay, this is something that I want to do whenever my component starts, or this is something I want to do whenever my component ends, or this is something I want to do whenever my component updates, whether it be due to a prop change or whether it be due to a state change. Also, I if I forget to mention that similar to changes amongst state, prop changes also causes a re-render, but prop changes in a running app in most times come from state changes of one form or the other. So a mental model good to keep in mind is that if a prop will change in any manner whatsoever, then the app will also re-render, and if the state changes, the app also gets re-rendered. And this is what I'm going to talk to you about in next lecture. I'm going to talk to you about all the lifecycle hooks and what they are used for, what they are, and how you might use them in a real world app. In that lecture also, once we are done talking about that, we are going to talk about map, filters and reduces, and then we are finally ready to start with our project. From coming lecture, one or two lecture in, I'm going to introduce you to what we are going to make as our project for this course. Then we are going to set up a different React app and we are going to start the project from scratch. We are going to build on small chunks, and then in no time you will see our app growing to enormous sizes. We're going to do all sort of crazy things with that, and we're going to put in all sort of features that the users of your app will definitely enjoy. And on that note, I'll take your leave for today, and I hope you learned a lot and I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm gonna see you next time with lifecycle hooks. And do make sure you learn that properly, because that is one of the crucialest features available in React. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.